however limited their own understanding of their ancient history is, are telling you that their history goes back really, really far.
Yeah.
Really far. And they're telling you that it is their bloodline. It is. It's an enjoyable movie. So around 3200, 3300 BC, up in the mountains, we see some, petroglyphs that we think are like the earliest form of hieroglyphs. The reason we think hieroglyphs are even formed is because society is getting so big that you need a way to keep track of things. You need a way to, there's civil court cases that come up, and we have court cases from ancient Egypt. We know that the tomb builders were also the tomb robbers because of court cases that we found on papyri.
Court cases.
Yeah, where people are being tried and convicted for crimes against the pharaoh or other important people, because these were people who were employed by day, they were tomb builders, and by night they robbed the tombs that they built because they knew how to do it.
What does an Egyptian court in 3200 BC look like?
Oh, well, I mean, we don't know. The papyrus I'm talking about, those don't go back to 3200 BC.
But it goes back far. How far?
The height of papyri that we see, where we have so much of it that we're able to fully translate Egyptian hieroglyphs, is during the Middle Kingdom. We're getting close to the Middle Kingdom going through our chronology. The Middle Kingdom begins in 1850 BC and ends, within a couple hundred years, 200 to 300 years after that. And that's really the height of literature. Like we have lots of these really wonderful stories that come out of Egypt. They're called laments, and it's just these people writing about their own lives. And there's a story about a guy who's suicidal, and he's he basically writes this kind of poem where he's arguing with his soul. So you have your Ka, and then you have your Ba, and it's like, one of them is your double vital essence, and he's like arguing with his own soul, and your soul is kind of what pulls you into the next world, and you don't want your soul to leave you, and it's a different being entirely. And he's like arguing with himself. He's basically saying, I'm so sad, I want to kill myself. And his Ka says, no, you can't do that, because if you do, I won't stay with you. I won't join you into the next world. And so, he eventually talks himself into not, killing himself. And so you have this height of writing for some reason in the Middle Kingdom. And there's a lot of papyrus, during this time that Egyptologists have learned to read. And so it's really kind of at its height. It's really kind of at its height in the Middle Kingdom, and then it reaches new heights in the New Kingdom. But you got to think the language changes over time. Have you ever heard people speaking Old English from 1,000 years ago, and it's literally a different language?
It's literally, yeah.
That happened to the Egyptians. There were Egyptians living during the time of Cleopatra that could not read Old Kingdom Egyptian hieroglyphs. The language the spoken language, for sure. I mean, as languages do, even though we don't have proof of it. Nobody can verbally speak Old Ancient Egyptian anymore. So the spoken language changes and the written language changes over time, but we can really read a lot of stuff from the Middle Kingdom. So anyways, yeah, it just evolves over time. So getting back to Senefru. So Senefru builds his Red Pyramid, and that is actually the first Great Pyramid, according to the traditional timeline. Now we're in a gray area where even I should preface everything by saying, I don't know. I just don't know. Even when you're studying things that are nearly 5,000 years old, at least, it's important to have an appreciation for how long 1,000 years is. Mm-hmm. Okay. And you can really only get there by spending a significant amount of time with history and studying it, because you can spend so much time studying things that happen over 1 century, and then you go times 10. Oh my God. Think about if you were to spend 10 years studying the span of history over 100 years. You would really get an idea of how long 100 years is. You multiply that by 10.
It's insane.
Multiply it by 47. And that's how far we are removed from, the youngest date of the Great Pyramids.
And you were telling me last night something like there being this 27,000 year record of pharaohs that a lot of historians ignore, that it could go back like that far. How do we know that?
Well, yeah, historians ignore it, and you're kind of alternative history researchers, like ancient history YouTubers, they both ignore it. And because I think it conflicts with both of their ideas, right?
How
So
so?
so academics, they brush off the 27,000 year kings list as being, so the Egyptians they have these long kings lists. There's one, I believe it's the Can we look up the Palermo stone? So I'm just so I know that I'm
Spelled
right.
like Palermo in Sicily?
Yeah, yeah.
Palermo.
Yeah, so the Palermo Stone, Egypt. I want to say it's yeah, yeah. So this is one of the examples of a king's list. Can you read that description, Alessi?
Which one? Right here. The
Yeah,
Palermo
yeah.
stone is one of 7 surviving fragments of steel known as Royal Annals of the Old Kingdom of Ancient Egypt. The stele contained a list of the kings of Egypt from the first dynasty through to the early part of the fifth dynasty and noted
Mhm.
significant events in each year of their reigns.
Sure. So this one goes from the first dynasty through what, the fifth dynasty? Well,
Yeah, fifth.
it's the old kingdom. This is documenting the time of the pyramid builders from the first dynasty to the end of the old kingdom, which we're getting to 2100 BC. There are other kings lists similar to this one that we find scattered in various places throughout Egypt, and you can only assume that they were in little places like museums, kind of like we were talking about. So this is the Palermo stone, very similar to the Narmer palette. It's these small stones that commemorate things. Eventually we're going to get into these things called stelae, which is this gigantic stone billboard where things are just carved up and down. Like you have the Dream stele that was erected in between the paws of the Sphinx, and it's the first monument that actually recognizes the Israelites. It's a lot of really cool stuff here. But this is the origins of these stelae, these giant stone billboards, and it's hard to find these things, and we kind of find them in some places. So there are other similar stones like this that have these kings lists that go back 27,000 years, and so the reality of it is interpreted. I don't know. Sometimes it's interpreted in a certain way, and sometimes it's just ignored. But let's say academics. They view it as, it just has to do with their mythology. It's not real. There's no significance to it. It just has something to do with their mythology, and we have to take it with a grain of salt. Mostly, just ignore it. Let's only consider the hard archaeological evidence. Does that make sense?
Yes.
The YouTube, I should say, there's this. What is it called? Like the YouTube archaeology wars. That's what was said on the Joe Rogan podcast. I think that's
Okay.
what it is. So you have this battle right now that's happening, basically since the big debate. And so ancient history YouTubers that kind of want to sell. I mean, you're making money doing it.
Of course they do.
You're selling something,
Yeah.
right? And there's a difference between doing it hyper honestly and really trying to teach your audience things that they want to know, right? Which probably isn't a great formula for being an honest person. They kind of ignore the King's List because what the King's List does is it shows that dynastic Egyptians were acknowledging their own history going back maybe not necessarily exactly 27,000 years, and the reigns that they attribute to these certain kings, like some kings rule for 15,000 years. Obviously you don't take that part seriously, but what it's indicating is that these people, however limited their own understanding of their ancient history is, are telling you that their history goes back really, really far.
Yeah.
Really far. And they're telling you that it is their bloodline. It is Egyptians that have lived in this land for this long. It is telling you that. However, there are people, with this idea that no. It's all in everyone's YouTube comments about when you talk about the pyramids. The Egyptians did not do this. It was a previous civilization. The Egyptians has nothing to do with it. Dude, we have bodies of Egyptians in the Cairo Museum of people who were alive 30,000 years ago. And you test their DNA and they are Egyptian, the same way people 4,000 years ago were Egyptians. It's the Egyptians telling you that their history is very ancient, however limited or advanced their understanding of it was. They get to a point, it's kind of like where we were talking about how, in recent history, you can document all these things. And then the further you get, it starts to go, you start to get in these big leaps of time. That's what they do with their King's List. It's like, from the fifth dynasty up to the first dynasty, it's, it's a very clear documentation of what's happening. Then you get beyond Narmer, the first pharaoh, and then it starts to take leaps through history. And because, that was a very long time ago, especially for them, especially when during this time period, humanity is beginning to formulate how to record history. So you have these tales that are brought down, and they probably have artifacts from these very, very remote time periods where they knew the context of it, but it's lost to us today. But what they are doing is conveying to eternity. They're speaking to us from the past and telling us, this is how far back my history goes. They may not be exactly right about how long the certain little periods were. They're telling us it goes back a tremendously long way.
But if pharaohs go back 27,000 years, that is if that's true, the ramifications of that historically could be insane.
Sure.
I mean, you're talking about living through both terrible physiological effects like the Younger Dryas period or something like that, to also fucking up timelines of all the ancient religious texts,
sure,
and everything, and what we know about world history to be.
Sure. And even we see it as okay, so that's 27,000 years before 4,000 years ago. So that's 31,000 years ago. All right. Let's say that we're looking at 2500 BC. Let's say they're off by 20,000 years. And really their history lane goes back 7,000 years earlier. That's 7,000 years of history that we didn't know about. And what they're telling us is that they have a very, 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 very long history, and that these are the people of this land. And so the reason that I take problem with wiping the Egyptians away and saying no, it was a completely different civilization. There's a number of reasons that there's an issue with that. One is that logically, you have now created an even harder argument for yourself. If you actually want to figure out the answer, you've now made it even harder for yourself, because you have now created a new civilization, and the only evidence you have for that are pyramids and big monuments. Where's all the other evidence? Like, surely these people had bodies, right? Surely if it's a different civilization, they're a different race of people, and not to get into like a racial thing, but I mean, it would have to be a different race of people with different DNA. We don't have those. We don't have that DNA. And then they could go, well, maybe they buried themselves in a different way. Maybe they're cremated. Maybe they don't have burials. Okay. What about their trash? Oh, well, maybe they deposited trash in a different way than we understand. Okay. What about all their buildings that they would have lived in? Oh, well, you don't really have an answer for that, because you got to be living somewhere. We have ancient Egyptian buildings, but they're Egyptian buildings. And then you just get to a point where you have to continue this idea that it was people who were not Egyptians doing it. You have to get to a point where you go, okay, well, maybe they. You have to do that dozens, and you have to do it hundreds of times to keep this idea going. How many times do you have to do it before you're okay, maybe they becomes okay, maybe they really did build it.
And maybe we're wrong. Yeah.
Maybe they really did build it in a way that we still can't explain, because after all of that, you still have to explain, how the hell did they do this? None of that explains. Like, the question is still there. Like I was saying, it's a question of not timeline really, but it's a question of technology. And by constantly attributing this to a different civilization, I think we're not even really getting close to answering the actual question, which is the mystery of how they did it, because it's still there. The statues, the amazing statues still exist. The amazing monuments still exist. It's all still there. We haven't even begun to answer the question of how they did it, because we're ignoring the people who did it by attributing it to a different civilization, when the Egyptians tell us their civilization goes back 27,000 years. Yeah. So you have both sides ignoring this, to meet an end, right?
Did you talk to Land Akem about this?
We only hung out for maybe like 3 days. And so we had...
In those 3 days, you didn't bring this up once?
No, because there's so many other things. There's so many other things to talk about.
What's his theory? Can you explain that to people?
Well, gosh. His theory is that the Egyptians were using... is that they were using pyramids as chemical processing plants, and that they were making certain chemicals like fertilizer for wheat and barley fields, which I certainly like that, right? Because it is complementing who the Egyptians are as a people. Their civilization is built on the back of wheat and barley, of selling grain.
Yep.
So okay, you come up with an alternate idea of how they can further be able to do this, and some like he has an idea of one of these places may be in a place where they make the blue paint that they're so famous for. I'm not an expert in his theory, but I certainly like his alternative theories. I think more than I like anybody else's because
Why?
it's a compliment to who the Egyptians were as a people. The pyramids are only two. They're only one of two things. Well, maybe it's three things, but it's either a tomb, or it's either partly a tomb and it's something else, or it's something that directly benefits the people of Egypt. And maybe it's all three at the same time.
How do you explain, and this might be totally out of left field with this explanation you're giving, but how do you explain the fact that around the world in antiquity, so many different civilizations who had no relation to each other that we can find built structures that were of this pyramid type build?
So the most obvious, I mean, you have structures throughout the world that are kind of pyramidal shape, I guess, or like the foundation of it is literally a pyramid that starts with a wider base and gets narrower up at the top. But the things that we would specifically say that is a pyramid really exist in Egypt, a little bit in Southeastern Asia, except those are like massive hybrids of all these different types of structures on one that start out wider at the base and get narrow towards the top. But really, it's Egypt and Mesoamerica, really Egypt and the Maya. And why they're so similar, it's one of two things. It's either an idea that is carried down through the ages. Actually, North American natives had pyramids too, but they're made out of earth. They're made out of packed clay earth. But had you seen them 3,000, 4,000 years ago, 9,000 years ago, you would have been very impressed. They seem like they're not so impressive now because this is like this slump, this sad slump of what once was. But they used to have 4 angles and like a flat top, and they were these giant pyramids. You would have been impressed had you seen it in their day. It's either a handing down of an architectural style, right? Making pyramids is handing down, and it disseminates throughout the planet. Or the boring answer is that it doesn't really matter where you put ants on the planet; they will build ant mounds. It just ends up happening because
or aliens teach them how to do
or
it.
aliens. I'm getting closer to that.
I know. I know. I'm gonna just tap push you there.
So that's kind of what I think. Now here, if we connect, the two most iconic places where pyramids are built on the planet, ancient Mesoamerica, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador.
That's going to be the next podcast.
Yeah. If we're going to be drawing connections between two most iconic places, Mesoamerica and Egypt, in Mesoamerica, all the pyramids are tombs. All of them. Without a doubt, every single pyramid in Mesoamerica is a tomb. So it's kind of like one of those things where it's like, I'll talk to people and be like, well, if you want to go down this way, you might be disappointed to find out that the ones in Mesoamerica are all tombs.
But maybe they weren't tombs first.
They weren't tombs first. They were actually places that you lived on top of it. And we'll get into this, but I should say it now. You lived on top of this pyramid, and then say your dad is a very wealthy Mesoamerican, and he lived on top of an elevated platform, and say it's 25 meters tall, and that's where he lives, and he has these stone walls that make up his little house that's on top of it. Well, when he dies, he gives you all of his inheritance, and those little rooms that he lived in with your mother, you take all of the stuff that's important to them, you put them inside the room, you bury them on their beds, and you turn their palace into a tomb. Does that make sense? You close in all the walls and you build boom, another pyramid on top of it. And on top of that pyramid, you lay a new platform that's even bigger, and that's your palace where you and your wife will live, where your children will bury you there and turn your palace into a tomb.
I see. That didn't go where I thought it was going. Okay.
Where do you think it was going?
I thought it was going to be something a little deeper than just like living quarters, but I got you.
Yeah. Now, there are pyramids in Mesoamerica where the whole thing was always intended to be a tomb. It made headlines when Albert Ruiz in, I think, 1953 or 1956, he discovered this entrance into a tomb, and we'll get into this too, but it's called Pakal's tomb, the Temple of Inscriptions, or the Pyramid of Inscriptions at the city of Palenque. And he pulled up this floor thing that was at the top of the pyramid, and it was the staircase that went down one way and then went down the other, and there's this giant tomb with a huge megalithic sarcophagus it would fill up this, the size of the sarcophagus would fill up this room. And that whole pyramid was only built to be that. So, I understand like the questioning the similarity thing, but then when you get to it, well, it's like those are tombs,
Right?
And I don't feel one way or the other about it or prefer one thing or the other. I just try to be honest with people when they ask, because people deserve to be told the truth.
100%, man.
Okay,
Are we on the part? Are we getting to the part of the timeline where we talk about Rome, or are we still got more?
we are about 30% into Egyptian history.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.